Right.
So our topic was to do with the pencil industry, looking at two companies called DIXON, TICONDEROGA and FABER-CASTELL. And for the rest of the presentation, we'll just say DIXON because TICONDEROGA is a bit of a mouthful. Basically, the three main key questions we got to what extent can the differing fortunes of DIXON, TICONDEROGA and FABER-CASTELL be explained by their very responsibility and challenges of globalisation? So the key was globalisation in the 1990s and kind of early 21st century. Where exactly did DIXON's management go wrong, and what are the management lessons we can learn from their mistakes? Okay, so just a brief history on the two companies. FABER-CASTELL was founded in 1761, which makes it the oldest continuously existing company in the pencil industry. It was founded in Nuremberg, which has another pencil company as well called Stadler or something. So there's kind of really intense competition just in one town, which has kind of driven them on to become really successful. In 1837, they modernised under the leadership of Lothar van Faber, who was the fourth generation. So basically, FABER-CASTELL is it's a family-run business. We're currently on the 8th generation of FABER-CASTELL leadership, and kind of gives it this continuity and real core to it, that it's got this kind of basic family tradition. The garden approach was used especially by Lothar van Faber, who he made his factories lighter and more airy, so the workers were more comfortable. He provided apartments for them right next to the factory, which were really comfortable, and he also set up a pension and a health insurance scheme for all the employees. In 1955, the company moved to the USA, which is quite interesting because DIXON only set up in 1829, so FABER-CASTELL was kind of already ahead of it and almost beat it to the USA market as well. The Second World War and the First World War impacted FABER-CASTELL very heavily because obviously they're a very global company, so the wars, being a German company, made it very difficult for them in British, American, French markets, and they were actually forced to sell in America. And yeah, we're now on the 8th generation of leader, who's called Count Anton Wolfgang von Faber-Castell. He's been in charge since 1978, so he's kind of overseen the whole globalization period. And the company now employs 7,000 people and a revenue of over 600 million euros. On the other hand, DIXON was set up in 1827 by Joseph DIXON, who was an inventor and quite a kind of good thinker. And in, I think it was the 1850s, 1860s, he invented a machine which allowed for mass production of pencils. So in 1872, they were making 86,000 pencils a day, which was more than FABER-CASTELL. So that was when DIXON was really strong, and it was selling very well in the US market. Recently, it's been part of a lot of mergers, so merged with the American Crayon Company and with Bryn Mawr Corporation, and this it's kind of diluted the company. They've got lots of different people coming in, and in 1983, the guy who was in charge during the real globalization period was Gino Palla, who was didn't have a history in the pencil making industry. He made his fortune running a restaurant, which was very successful. So he kind of didn't have the same experience as Count Anton Wolfgang von Faber-Castell might have. And then we see in the 90s two headquarters move, which kind of was probably very costly firstly, and also really unsettled the company. And in 2000, DIXON set up a subsidiary company in China, which, if you compare to when FABER-CASTELL kind of took advantage of the Asian market, they set up in 1980, and that factory is the largest eraser factory in the world. And in 2004, following quite a difficult period during globalization, DIXON was sold to Fila, an Italian company, and production stopped in the USA.
I'm going to try and answer our first question: to what extent did the differing fortunes of DIXON, TICONDEROGA and FABER-CASTELL
known by their very responses to challenges posed by globalisation and business activity. But since 1990, it sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully I can sort of clarify it for you guys. So basically, globalisation really kicked off probably 1980s, 1990s with new technology, new forms of transport, and also communications, which made the world a much smaller place, and it meant that the world pencil market, as well as all other markets, got a lot smaller and a lot more competitive. And in terms of the pencil market, it was mainly competition from China and really cheap manufacturing, which was what affected the firms that we're talking about. For example, in 1990, the US pencil market was made up of only 16% by imports, but then by 1999, 50% was imported. So you can see how that sharp rise over that decade. This was particularly bad for DIXON, as they were traditionally a low-cost manufacturer. They sold just a standard old pencil for a low price, and with good quality and cheaper competition from China, this was really affecting them, and we saw during this period they really struggled with losses, and they lost a lot of market share. An accusation was made that China was dumping its pencils on the world market. That is, they're selling them for below their production cost, which made it impossible to compete for a lot of American and European firms. Clearly, this would have affected FABER-CASTELL as well. They're in the same market, so it only makes sense. But we don't see them suffering to the same extent, and hopefully we'll find out why. The first difference between the two firms was the level at which they pitched their products. So FABER-CASTELL, they adjusted to aim their products at a slightly higher end of the market. So they had products such as the Perfect Pencil, which can be bought for €200, sorry. And they also, it wasn't just your common garden pencil. It was something a bit special. And this meant they weren't directly competing with the cheapest pencils on the market, which they couldn't compete with because China's production was so much cheaper. This is in contrast to DIXON, who stayed focused on their flagship product, which is the No. 2 pencil, which was supposed to be a cheap pencil, and they marketed it at schools and that sort of audience. But they were losing out because they hadn't diversified, and perhaps they should have done that and aimed for more niche products in order to beat out the competition from China. And in the meantime, FABER were innovating at all times. In 2000, they brought out the Grip 2001, which you might have seen is a grey pencil, triangular shaped, ergonomic shape, with black dots for grip. And this is now one of their best-selling products. Also, relocation of production is one of the major factors that was different between the two firms. In 1980, FABER-CASTELL had set up an eraser factory in Malaysia, as we've heard, and it is now the largest in the world. And that was well before competition started coming into the market, so they'd already taken advantage of cheap production abroad. They also kept their intellectual headquarters in Nuremberg, in Germany, taking advantage of the skilled labour force there. But they also now have production facilities in 14 different countries, so that's really helping them today in cheap production. And now they're the largest pencil manufacturer in the world. DIXON, however, kept most of their production in the USA in the 1980s and 90s, where obviously labour costs are slightly more expensive than they might be elsewhere. It wasn't until the mid-90s that they finally reacted to globalisation and moved to set up a factory in Mexico. And I think there's an article that says something like $10 per worker in making that move, which is quite significant overall, and helped them. And so that they furthered this process now. They've relocated a lot more to Mexico. 80% of their coloured pencils are now made there. And today they're actually being reasonably more successful than they have been in the past, and their market share is actually growing in the USA finally again. Other than management decisions, there may be some other factors which determine their fortunes. It may be that the great level of brand loyalty FABER-CASTELL built up, one of the oldest companies in the world, has really helped them through these difficult times, whereas DIXON possibly didn't have that loyalty. Also, there's an argument that a family-run business might have been more successful during this time compared to a faceless corporation like DIXON. They've been taken over in 2004 by Fila, an Italian manufacturer, and possibly the fact that the familiarity of the family-run business has helped FABER during this time. And we can't discount luck either. It may have just been a lucky day for FABER-CASTELL.
So I'm going to talk about where the management went wrong with DIXON. So these four main areas: there's overdependence on trade barriers, there's slow really seen this as a short-term sort of barrier for them to lower their labour costs in order to compete. They should have really restructured and diversified really fast, but they didn't really finish doing this until 1996, by which point China had already taken a really high percentage of the market share again, and they were even further behind. This management is seen as even worse if you compare it to how FABER-CASTELL reacted in a similar situation. So between 1992 and 1993, their German production made significant losses. So they straight away reduced the workforce by 30%. They restructured their whole company into 5 defined sectors of writing, drawing, painting, creative arts, and cosmetic products. So they were really diverse, completely restructured it. With their slow-paced outsource, obviously China's main cost advantage was its cheaper labour, and as a high percentage of the cost of the pencil, that means if they'd lowered it, they would have been able to make a much cheaper pencil and increase their global competitiveness, especially as they had the first mover advantage in the US with the famous No. 2 pencil. Had they moved faster to Mexico or to China, they would have been able to retain that market share much more effectively. Once again, if you compare this to FABER-CASTELL, their outsource was in 1980 to Malaysia for the razor plant, which is now the biggest in the world. So obviously they had more time to set that up, become established, they had more time to train their workers, and they were ahead of the Chinese, sensing the opportunities from globalization right from the beginning. Also, their over-reliance on the cheap pencils. While this product was a great product, they should have taken the profits they made from this early on and diversified into other regions so that in case competition came on their cheap pencils, they would have been able to rely on the other source. In research and development, they could have gone for lots of other things such as sustainable, which consumers like. They went for a green pencil, but the research and development was really ineffectively done. It clogged up all the sharpeners, so obviously that market was a failure. And once more, if you look at FABER-CASTELL, it's completely different. In 1980, they went for a complete mixed marketing strategy with loads of different products, from felt tips to cosmetic brushes, and they went for a really luxury angle to their product, separating them from the Chinese with the $200 pencil and the Nova collection, which was just 5 pencils and sharpener, which sold for $100. So obviously taking themselves out of the cheap market. And in research and development, FABER-CASTELL really well known for its sustainability. In the 90s, they started a sustainable forestry project in Brazil, which now they can grow 20 cubic centimetres of wood per hour. They have eco-friendly water, which is eco-friendly paint, which is basically around water. And in Costa Rica, they have a plant which they make ecological timber for their pencils and slats. So obviously this is sustainable, which appeals to the consumer, and it's also lowering their costs at the same time. So for all of these management problems, it just seems that DIXON weren't dynamic enough for the global economy, and they were slow to respond to the market signals and didn't grasp the opportunities that globalization had to offer.
Okay, so finally we're going to look at the management lessons that we can learn from the varying experience of these two companies. So on this slide I've just got a couple of these management lessons that I think we should go over. So first of all, brand management, which is the analysis and planning of how the brand's positioned within a market and why they've targeted that market. With these two companies, we've obviously got DIXON's targeted the much lower end of the market, with No. 2 pencil particularly, and FABER that's gone for a higher end. There's no problem in aiming at the lower end of the market, but in this case, obviously with globalisation, we've seen an influx of production in China, selling in the US. So that did mean that they were obviously directly competing with DIXON, whereas FABER-CASTELL have managed to avoid this issue by targeting a higher market. So they haven't lost anywhere near the market share during this period as DIXON have. The lesson here really is that whilst DIXON have a wealth of experience in the pencil industry, being the second oldest American pencil manufacturer, they didn't use any of this experience at all in changing its marketing or its branding or anything like that. So therefore, they really have struggled up until the last couple of years, but they have diversified slightly. Second of all, we look at the garden versus machine approach. The garden approach is obviously much more friendly towards the employees than the machine approach, hoping that will incentivise the workers to work harder. And particularly with the garden approach, it works well with creative production. So although in terms of the just manufacturing shouldn't make too much difference. In the early years of FABER-CASTELL, we can see a much more diverse range of products, which I believe comes from the garden approach. Also, I would like to link in that Faber is a family-run company, or in Germany this is like the Mittelstand business system. And just like Justin said, I believe this really links into sort of how they've branded themselves as a family company, which has kept a much more friendly face to them, as opposed to DIXON's much more faceless corporate branding. And particularly in the last sort of 20 years, their marketing really did just sort of cease to exist, and they just relied on selling to schools because it was the standard pencil used in exams. DIXON, on the other hand, has changed management sort of 3-4 times in the last 50 years. Particularly significant was Gina Palla, who took over in 1983, I believe. And during these changes in management, they've changed headquarters 3 times, I believe, which has really just been an unnecessary cost to the firm and destabilised the business. I think the lesson here is that although change can be really beneficial for business, when change is just for the sake of change, it really is just a waste of money and really hasn't benefited them at all. Thirdly, I'd like to look at contingency thinking. Gareth Morgan has 4 points on this, the first of which is that organisations are open systems that need careful management to satisfy and balance internal needs and to adapt to environmental circumstances. I think from this it's quite clear that Faber really have succeeded in this, in that they've managed to adapt to globalisation and embrace that, whereas when we look at DIXON, they've really just stayed the same. They've failed to adapt completely to all the different circumstances. Second of all, they say that there's no one best way of organising. The appropriate form depends on the kind of task and environment one is dealing with. Management must be concerned above all else with achieving alignments and good fits. And finally, different types or species of organisations are needed in different types of environment. This clearly makes the point that with globalisation there's a need for change within the organisation, which we've seen DIXON fail to do up until the takeover by FILA in 2004. And we've got Porter's strategy next. So the first of these is in terms of cost leadership, and that's when a firm was set out to be the lowest cost producer within its industry. Now this was obviously the approach that DIXON took, especially this number 2 pencil. But as we've seen, this would rely on economies of scale, new technologies and preferential access to raw materials. In terms of Chinese production, they have much cheaper access to raw materials, and also with economies of scale, because they've managed to become much larger as well, they have become much cheaper. So a low-cost producer must find and exploit all of those factors to become the cheapest and best performer in its industry. As we can see, DIXON, TICONDEROGA did have this up until the influx of Chinese pencils. So I think the lesson here is that you must outsource as soon as you can see that you're losing your competitive advantage. Second, I've looked at differentiation, which is where a firm seeks to be unique. Now clearly FABER-CASTELL have done this well, in that they've produced a $200 pencil, which would sound quite ridiculous compared to pencils you can buy for 50p, but it has been a good seller and has a much higher markup. So because they've uniquely positioned themselves to meet those needs of their consumers, they can charge a premium price. Finally, I've looked at inside outthinking and outside in. The first of which means you're focusing on what you think is best for the business, which I believe is what DIXON have done in just taking it easy, really relying on their number 2 pencil. Whereas outside in thinking is looking at the business from the customer's perspective. I really think that's what Faber have done, particularly with their more recent development of the triangular pencil, which is obviously all about ergonomics and looking at what's best for the consumer. Hence they've continued to innovate and become a much better company. Finally, I've also looked at logistics as another factor in the company, and this is a lesson that I think DIXON really have learned since the takeover in 2004. Tim Gomez has taken over as CEO. In the last 5 years, he's managed to cut $5 million worth of costs just in shipping and transportation. When they moved to Mexico and they also moved to China, they failed straight away to develop any sort of new system in terms of transportation, so the costs were still ridiculously high.